They said she came out of the desert barefoot, her dress torn, her eyes colder than a prairie winter. No one knew her name, and no one asked. But when she walked into that town and stared down the sheriff, folks stopped what they were doing. She pointed at the man who once owned her pain and said real slow, "If you touch me again, I'll burn this town." No one laughed. And the only man who didn't flinch was a lonely rancher leaning against a wooden post, chewing the silence like it was the last piece of jerky he had. The town was called Calico Ridge, just a scatter of wooden buildings leaning into the wind, like they'd been tired for years. One dirt road ran straight through it, wide enough for a wagon and narrow enough for trouble. August had settled in heavy that year. The heat didn't just burn your skin, it got in your lungs, in your thoughts. Dust floated in the air like slow ghosts, never landing, never leaving. The saloon had its doors wide open, not for business, but because the hinges were broken. Horses stood still in the shade like they understood the heat better than men ever would. A tin water trough sat dry in front of the old general store, the kind that still sold bullets right next to sugar. People didn't talk much in Calico Ridge, especially not to strangers. Everyone carried the weight of something, a war, a loss, a name they didn't want anymore. And the silence between those buildings wasn't just quiet, it was loaded, like it knew a storm was coming, and it wasn't going to be rain. That day, the sky hung low and yellow, stretched thin like it could tear if you said the wrong thing too loud. Somewhere out past the hills, a hawk cried once, and then went quiet, like even it didn't want to stick around. That's when she showed up. No horse, no hat, just rage and bones and dust between her toes. His name was Eli Cutter, though no one called him that unless they needed something fixed or buried. Folks just called him Cutter, like a warning or a question they didn't want answered. He owned a stretch of dry land 5 miles west of town, where the grass came up mean and the cattle didn't last long. But he stayed anyway, had been staying for 12 years. They said he came back from a war with a limp and a silence that made dogs uneasy. He never talked about the battles or the woman he lost before he even made it home. People remembered her, a soft-spoken schoolteacher with red in her hair and books in her hands. She drowned one spring when the river rose too fast, trying to save a child that wasn't hers. After that, Eli didn't talk much. He built his fences high, kept his doors unlocked, and drank his coffee black even when it was hot enough to cook an egg on the porch rail. He was the kind of man who didn't blink when something loud happened, the kind who could sit still for hours without saying a word and somehow still make you feel like you were being heard. So when a girl walked into town with her threat and her fire, everyone watched her. But he watched something else. The way her hands shook, the way she stood tall anyway, the way her eyes had that look, the same look he carried around like a scar he stopped trying to hide. And in that moment, Eli Cutter knew 2 things. She wasn't just passing through, and he wasn't going to let her burn alone. She came in just before sundown, when the heat finally broke and the shadows started reaching long across the street. Nobody knew her name yet, but she walked like someone who'd had it stolen and wasn't asking for it back. Her dress was torn at the sleeves, one boot missing, and dried blood crusted on the side of her neck like she hadn't noticed, but didn't care. She stopped in front of the sheriff's office. The air went still. A poker game paused mid-hand in the saloon. A boy leaned too far out a second-floor window and got yanked back by his mama. Then the door opened. Sheriff Boyd stepped out, still chewing his supper. Heavy man, heavy badge. Thought he was the law just because he'd stayed in town longer than his own shadow. He looked her up and down like she was a stray dog. Smirked. "You look lost, girl," he said. She didn't answer, just stared at him, the kind of stare that doesn't blink, not out of pride, but because blinking might let a tear fall. "You need help?" he added, still smiling. That's when she said it. Quiet first, then louder. "If you touch me again," she said, her voice shaking but sharp, "I'll burn this town." Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. The sheriff's smile faded. His hand hovered too close to his belt. And that's when Eli Cutter stepped off the porch across the street, slow like he wasn't interrupting anything, just stretching his legs. He crossed the dirt road without a word, stood between her and the sheriff, and looked Boyd straight in the eyes. "She's not lost," Eli said. "She's here." The sheriff looked at him long, like he wanted to argue. But then something in Cutter's eyes, made him think twice. He turned and went back inside. And just like that, Calico Ridge had a fire smoldering in its center. No flames yet, but folks could feel the heat coming. Eli didn't ask her name. He didn't ask where she came from or what the sheriff had done. He just nodded toward his horse tied up outside the saloon and said, "Come on." She hesitated, looking down at her bare foot, then back up at him. For a second, she seemed ready to run, not because she was scared of him, but because she was tired of trusting the wrong people. But Eli didn't move, didn't coax, just waited. And somehow that was enough. She limped toward him, slow and stiff. When she reached the horse, he helped her up, careful not to touch her skin. He used his coat like a blanket between his hands and her back, like he understood she needed space more than comfort. She didn't thank him. He didn't expect her to. The ride out to his ranch was quiet. The kind of quiet that wasn't awkward, just wide, like the land itself. Sagebrush rolled by on either side. Coyotes yelped far off in the dark, but neither of them turned their heads. When they reached his cabin, he swung off the saddle first and held the reins. She slid down on her own, favoring her left leg. He opened the door, stepped aside, and let her walk in before him. Inside, the air was cooler, shaded still. He handed her a clean cloth and pointed toward a bucket of well water. She didn't speak, but when she looked at him, something softened. Not a thank you. Not yet, but something like it. By morning, word had already spread. The girl with fire in her voice was sleeping out at Cutter's place, and half the town was chewing over it like old tobacco. Nobody had seen her ride in, and nobody saw her leave, which meant she was still there. And in a town like Calico Ridge, stillness made people nervous. Down at the Mercantile, Mrs. Purdy whispered to the preacher's wife that she might be an outlaw. Over at the barber shop, two ranch hands swore she looked like the daughter of a man who vanished near the border years back, the kind of man who left more enemies than cattle. Some said she was wild. Some said she was cursed. One man said he saw a mark on her wrist, something dark like a brand, and swore it was witch work. No one could prove a thing, but that didn't stop the talk. Sheriff Boyd, nursing his bruised pride, let the rumors do the work for him. He sat on his porch all afternoon, gun across his lap, waiting for something, anything, to give him a reason. Even the children knew better than a plane near Eli Cutter's fence that week. His ranch, once forgotten and quiet, now had eyes on it from every angle. But Eli didn't come to town, and she didn't leave. Inside that cabin, the silence stretched, safe and heavy like a blanket pulled over old wounds. But outside, the fire was building. On the fourth day, they came riding in, 4 men on tall horses, dressed in trail dust and bad intentions. They didn't speak to anyone when they entered Calico Ridge, just rode slow down the center of town like they already owned it. The leader, a tall man in a black hat, had a scar so deep across his chin it made his smile look broken. Sheriff Boyd stood when he saw them, but he didn't move from his porch. He knew who they were, or at least what they were. The kind of men that didn't write letters, just carved messages in a bone. The one in black leaned down to the sheriff. "We're looking for a girl," he said. "Small, dark hair, might be limpin, might be hiding." The sheriff took a long drag off his cigarette and said, "This town ain't the kind that hides people." The man in black smiled. "Every town hides something. All we gotta do is dig." They didn't bother with questions after that. Just turned their horses west and started down the road toward Eli Cutter's land. Eli was on the porch when he saw them coming. He didn't go for his rifle, didn't yell. He just stepped down, slow, and waited near the gate. She came outside behind him, silent, barefoot again. When the riders stopped at the fence line, the one in black tipped his hat toward her. "Well," he said, "ain't you a hard girl to lose?" She didn't answer. The man looked at Eli. "Step aside. She ain't yours." Eli didn't blink. "She ain't anyone's." For a moment, no one moved. Even the wind stood still. Then the man in black leaned forward in his saddle and said, "You don't know what you're protecting, friend." Eli answered, voice low, "I know enough." The girl's hand brushed Eli's coat sleeve, not pulling, just resting. That was all it took. And for the first time since she got there, she didn't look like she was running. She looked like she was ready to stand. The man in black dismounted, slow and heavy like someone who'd rather beat answers out of the ground than ask for them. He stepped forward, boots crunching the dry dirt, his hand resting near his gun like it was second nature. "Girl," he said, "you know how this ends. You come back now, it don't have to be messy." She stepped out from behind Eli, quiet but steady. The wind picked up just a little, pulling strands of hair across her face. She didn't move them. "You sold me," she said, loud enough to reach the others still on horseback. "You tied me to a fence post like I was livestock. And when the sheriff came, you told him I ran off with stolen silver." The man's mouth twitched just a little. She took another step. "I begged. I cried. You laughed." Her voice cracked, but her feet didn't. "But look at you now. 4 of you, all armed. And I'm still not scared." The man in black opened his mouth to speak, but she raised her hand. Not to strike, just to stop him. And strangely, he did. "You don't get to say my name anymore," she said. "You don't get to call me anything." And then she turned, not to run, but to walk back to the porch. Eli stood there, watching her. He didn't smile. He didn't need to. His silence said everything. The man in black looked between her and Eli, chewing the choice. But something had shifted. She wasn't the one on the ground anymore. He was. The man in black didn't draw his gun. Maybe it was the way Eli stood, like a man who'd already decided what he'd die for. Or maybe it was the look in her eyes, the kind that didn't carry fear anymore, just memory. Whatever it was, he stepped back. Slow, stiff, like retreat tasted worse than blood. He mounted his horse without a word. The others followed, all 4 turning their backs to the ranch without a fight. No one chased them. No one needed to. Back in town, folks watched from porches and windows as the dust of the riders faded into the horizon. No cheers, no questions. Just quiet. Later that evening, Mrs. Purdy left a small sack of dried bread on Eli's porch. No note, just kindness with no name on it. At the saloon, someone poured a second whiskey and set it at the empty chair next to theirs. Didn't ask who it was for. Didn't have to. Even the sheriff stayed quiet. He walked past the ranch gate at dusk and tipped his hat. Not an apology, but in surrender. And inside the cabin, she sat in the corner near the window, legs tucked beneath her, watching the sky change color. She didn't speak. Eli didn't ask her to. He brought her a blanket. She took it. For the first time in days, she slept without waking at every sound. And out in the distance, the wind carried no footsteps, just the slow breath of land that had seen one more fire pass through and not take everything with it. In the days that followed, nothing grand happened, and maybe that was the miracle. She started waking before the sun, wrapping herself in one of Eli's old coats and walking the fence lines like she belonged there. Her limp faded slowly. Her eyes didn't. Eli didn't try to fix her. He just made space. He mended the barn roof while she fed the chickens. They didn't speak much, but silence between them had turned from heavy to warm, like coffee left on the stove just in case someone came home. One morning, she found a little tin box on the windowsill. Inside was a bar of soap, a comb, and a hair tie. No note, no questions, just things she hadn't asked for, and somehow needed more than food. She started humming sometimes while she worked, soft and low. Eli heard it through the walls and didn't say a word. But the next day, she found a wind chime hanging near the porch. Just metal scraps tied to twine, but when the breeze hit it, it sang like something free. At night, she lit a small candle in the window. Not for light, just for something to glow. And Eli? He started sitting outside with a second cup of coffee, even if she didn't join him. Some wounds bleed loud, others heal quiet. And on that ranch, with no promises made and none needed, quiet was finally enough. It was nearly dusk when a knock came. Not loud, just enough to be heard over the wind. Eli opened the door, rifle in hand, but lowered. On the porch stood a woman, older than the girl, younger than Eli, with dust on her boots and tired in her bones. She held nothing but a leather satchel and a look that said she'd run out of road. Inside the cabin, the girl had already stood up. She stepped forward slowly, her breath caught somewhere between her ribs and her memory. "I was with you," the woman said, voice rough from the trail. "Back in Texas, before they split us up." The girl didn't cry. She just stepped forward and wrapped her arms around the woman like she'd been carrying that hug for years. No one asked where she'd come from. No one asked what she'd seen. Eli set out another plate at the table without saying a word, just scooped an extra spoonful of beans and slid it across the wood. Later that night, the three of them sat on the porch, wrapped in shared silence. The woman stared up at the sky. The girl leaned her head on her shoulder, and Eli watched the land like he always did, steady, quiet, present. Sometimes healing doesn't come from medicine. Sometimes it shows up at your door, tired, afraid, but alive. And all it needs is a place to sit. The next morning, just as the sun started to rise, the girl stepped outside with something in her hands. It was a small burlap sack, worn, dirty, tied shut with old twine. The same sack they had once pulled over her head. She stood at the edge of the porch, the wind tugging gently at her hair, and stared out over the open land. Eli watched from the doorway. He didn't ask what she was doing. He already knew. She untied the twine with careful fingers and opened the sack. For a moment, she just looked inside, as if seeing her past one last time. Then she held it up, turned it loose, and let the wind take it. The empty sack caught in the breeze, danced once in the air, and drifted out across the dry grass, away from the cabin, away from the pain, until it was just a piece of nothing in the sky. She didn't smile, but she stood straighter. Behind her, the woman stepped outside and took her hand. Eli nodded once. Not to her, not to anyone, just to the land itself. Like something old had ended, and something better had begun. Some stories don't end with justice. Some don't end with revenge. They end with someone finally sleeping through the night, with someone knocking on a door and not being turned away, with silence that no longer hurts to hear. What happened in Calico Ridge wasn't written down in the law books. The sheriff never changed his ways. The townspeople kept whispering, kept guessing. But something shifted, deep and quiet like water under rock. A girl who had nothing left walked into town, ready to burn it down. And a man who'd already lost everything gave her one reason not to. They never spoke much about what came before. They didn't need to, because in the end, survival ain't always loud. Sometimes it looks like tending chickens. Sometimes it sounds like wind chimes on the porch. Sometimes it's just showing up day after day and staying. And the strongest people, they're not the ones who scream. They're the ones who keep going, even when nobody claps for them, even when they carry scars no one sees. They build something out of the ashes, and they make damn sure it doesn't burn again. If this story found a place in you, if it reminded you of someone who fought quiet battles and still stood tall, don't let it pass like dust in the wind. Leave a comment. Share your thoughts. Subscribe for more stories about strength, silence, and second chances. Because out here in the West, every scar has a story worth telling.